Good afternoon, everyone. If you are here for a panel about revolutionary leaders, you are in the right place because we have 4 of them up here. And I'm tremendously excited because we're going to have a conversation that we had a few months ago in October and at a conference in Nashville, and replay it with some new data points about the evolution of choice in K12 education and what this moment means and what we can learn from the past and where we've been. And to help us think through that, we're just going to go straight around. We've got Diane Tavenner, Kim Smith, Amar, Kumar, and Joe Connor. And they will tell you about their organizations as we go through it, but it's not really about their orgs right now, but more about where they've been. And Kim, I just want to start with you right up top here. Because I think everyone thinks choice is like this newfangled thing. ESAs, micro schools. As you know, this has been the work of several decades, that charters have been around for a while. We've had the accountability movement. You, of course, founded New Schools Venture Fund, and you spurred a lot of innovation in the field. So I'd just love you to give us some perspective as we start off the conversation. Having seen what's come before, looking at the current moment, put it in context for us. What's same, what's different, where are the hopes, where are things maybe we've learned some lessons that we can do differently?
That's officially the year-old, could you start us out question, right? So thank you for that, I appreciate that. That's a big question. Yeah, choice is not new. Putting it in the charter context, we have a bunch of charter people in the room here, but it does feel like a different moment now. When we did first start charters, we did have a voucher movement at the same time, which created a little bit of room to maneuver, and charters were seen as a third way that brought in some public accountability along with parent choice. COVID's different. The generational transition we're in is different. A lot of the learners we're working with are digital natives and just think differently about the way they want to learn. Parent agency coming out of COVID is different. Learners' expectations about, or learners understanding the way they are not getting any agency in the current system, even within charters. So there was a sense that the choice brought to the table with charters could create agency for parents and students. But following COVID, I think there's this sensibility that they got so re-regulated that it just didn't really happen. And so the feeling with the micro schools and pods was to take a different level of agency. So it feels like the moment is different. You asked a huge question about what we've learned, so I'm not going to try to tackle that. But the one thing I will say is, I think one of the questions we have to figure out in this moment is, how do we do a better job of learner agency and learners getting what they need as individual learners? That's legitimate need that we didn't address well in the charter movement. And how do we continue to figure out a new way to think about the common good and what it is that brings us together, so we don't go toward the learners in a way that just balkanizes us entirely. So I feel like that's a different kind of challenge for this moment.
So 2 things for us to hold as we go through this conversation, and I think we want to revisit those themes. Hi, Diane. Diane, of course, formerly led Summit Public Schools for 20 years, and we'll talk about your startup maybe later, but we do Class Disrupted podcast together, of course. And on that podcast, you said that charters, in essence, hadn't been the change agent.
Never record with Michael, because he'll hold it.
I'm quoting. I've got quotes here. For improved pupil learning that you had perhaps hoped for when you first got in the game some 20 years ago. The charters haven't contributed the innovations perhaps to the learning model that were needed. And you said that you both think there's a profound role for charters to play over the next 1, 2, 3 decades, but you're wondering if they're really going to play it or not. Your words, not mine. So I would love you just to explain that and put it, against what Kim just said, that this moment is different. Help us understand what you mean by that.
Well, I think that, when I think that came in the context of what are the contributions charters have made. And when I think about, the 2 big contributions they've made, the first is we were able to, in some ways, break the monopoly and introduce the concept of breaking the monopoly. And I hope there's more to come along those lines. And so I think that's a profound contribution. Thank you to you. And while we're all here, a moment to thank our dear friend Don Shalvey, who has recently passed and who played such a huge role in that. And then I think the second piece is we really worked on the efficiency of school and making schools, inclusive of as many people as possible. And, there's a whole conversation about what that looks like in the modern world, and efficient and safe and productive. We were all most of us were going towards college for all because we truly believed that was the way forward and that was what was best for kids. And at some level that hasn't changed, but it is fundamentally different today. We now know that just a blind drive towards college for all is not yielding the results we want for all kids. And so that's a thing we have to question, and that's some of the work that I'm on right now. In terms of going forward, I think the opportunity continues to be for charters to truly use their innovative powers to literally redesign the way we learn. And this has been the work of Summit for 20 years. It is the work of Summit under these, in the capable hands of these amazing next generation leaders. But it's not what we see across the entire spectrum. And what I worry about is, in a lot of states, as you said, Michael, the re-regulation, the hostility, certainly in the states that Summit operates, California and Washington, we're just trying to stay alive. And it's impossible to innovate when you're just trying to stay alive. Now, there's plenty of other states where it's a much friendlier environment, but then we are gonna have to expect the innovation there. And I'm not sure that charters are structured to do that, given all of the outcomes that they have to hit in order to just have the right to operate.
Just the right to operate. All right, let me turn to Amar then, because you're running KaiPod Learning, of course, which is, for those that don't know, a network of managed micro schools. You've heard Kim and Diane sort of give us some context of educational choice, innovation in the past, and the current moment, saying that it feels different. I'd love your take if you think the current moment, the entrepreneurs that you're supporting and so forth, does it feel meaningfully different from your perch, and how?
Yes, very much. So at KaiPod, we help teachers start their own schools for their communities. And there's three things that are happening that are just significantly different than even 5 years ago. First is on the demand side, we have many, many more parents who say COVID took the beer goggles off. I thought my school was excellent, but it's not as excellent as I thought. So we have almost 40% of parents this spring looking for alternatives for the fall. Actively looking. That's never been that high, and it continues to rise. So there you've got a ton of demand coming into the market for an alternative. You got teachers who say, I'm extremely upset at my job. 73% of teachers saying they're not going to be in the profession in 4 years. There's 3 million humans that are going to disappear from that classroom. What are they going to do? So there's a huge supply that's ready for an alternative. And then you've got the rise of school funding, school choice, education savings accounts that are saying, now let's level the playing field between free public and other alternatives. So you put those three things together. You have this huge demand entering the market, you have the possibility of supply being created, and then you have some playing fields being leveled. And so I think Joe probably knows these numbers better than me, but it's like 1 in 4 kids now has access to an education savings account, which means they can take their existing state tax dollars and apply them to a school of choice. That makes it way more possible to compete if you're building an alternative. Previously, the only parents you could compete for were the ones who could afford your private school. But now, with an education savings account, you can compete for those parents on the basis of your outcomes and the basis of the quality of your program. And that's how it should be.
All right, so with that as context, Joe, you, of course, running Odyssey, starting Odyssey, you're essentially the infrastructure that helps power a lot of these education savings accounts, essentially allowing families to take these dollars and, yes, seamlessly spend it on state-approved educational options. And those are schools, micro schools, but they're also tutoring, they're equine therapy, they're all sorts of things, right? And I think many are worried, wondering if we're going to see, yes, an explosion of choices, but that it might not help. And let's put the two goals that Kim put forth on the table here. It might not help around the learner progression, them getting what they need, as well as the common good. How do you think about that space and against those two goals?
Yeah, I think, so in a past life, I was an attorney, practiced for 5 years at a law firm. So the way that I approach education is actually from a legal perspective, which is basically that in any US state, you have a few different options for mandatory enrollment of your children, which all 50 states have. You can either go to the public school, you can go to charters, where those are legal, you can go to the private school, or you can go to homeschool. And if you think of those as a continuum, the public schools are the most heavily regulated. Charter schools are often less so, although you might be able to quibble because of outcomes there. Private schools would be next, and then homeschools over here. For those who don't know, I mean, homeschools really depends on the state, but there's almost no regulation there. And private schools have a little regulation. Once again, it depends on the state. So
Charter schools are hostily regulated, I would say.
What'd you say?
Hostily regulated.
Hostily regulated, fair enough. So, but I think this is important because private schools have always existed in the US, and they typically have always been very lightly regulated. And I think what you're seeing with private school choice is you're taking an existing type of school, you are allowing funding to flow to it, and essentially the schools are not necessarily acting like a charter, where a charter is kind of created by an act of law, and it's basically a trade-off. We will give you this autonomy in return for the fact that you have to hit really outstanding academic results in most states. Vouchers and ESAs are very different. It's basically, I think, responding to some kind of secular trends that existed pre-COVID, got kind of hyper-accelerated during COVID. And it's saying that, you know what, parents are exiting the school system anyway, and we think it's good policy, and in some places good politics, to allow funding to follow them. And so I think that that's actually kind of at the heart of what you expect from those schools. Charters really are a trade-off with the expectation that there will be high standards. Vouchers and ESAs, in some states can have that, but that really isn't, I think, part of the trade-off. Really what it is we think it is a good thing overall to give families money and to allow them to make the best decisions, and we will lightly regulate that. And I think just interestingly, I mean, no charter law, no voucher, no ESA law is a monolith, so every state's very different. What passes in Arizona looks very different in South Carolina than Iowa. So even within, I would say, the ESA world, there are some ESAs that I think have more of those kind of outcomes where they are requiring standardized tests, they're requiring portfolios, they're requiring regular check-ins. And then there are some states where almost none of those things exist. And so I think that is kind of important to the conversation.
All right, so you all have given us the landscape, if you will, but now I'm going to ask you to dig into the opinion and what you think ought to happen. This is where I'm going to back away a little bit and have you all mix it up. And I guess I want to start with this frame, which is that, our friend Nina Reese stepped down, obviously this fall, from the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, as CEO there. And in some of the things that she said as she left and reflected on the progress around charters, was that she noticed that achievement had gone up over time, if you looked at the Credo studies and so forth, right? And one of her observations was that it went up most in places where authorizers of these charters had really focused on student outcomes, and that's where you'd seen the progress. So now I want to put this against the context where we're going to see all sorts of different policies, very light hand on some of the education savings accounts, some heavier with standardized testing, parent accountability, government having a role, et cetera, et cetera. How do we, frankly, even marketplaces like yours starting to give ratings and transparency, I imagine, although I won't put you on the spot there. But how should we start to think about this? Because this feels like there's evidence pointing in lots of different directions over what we need. I'm looking at you, Diane, because I want you to jump in first, and then whoever wants to come in can.
Well, results went up on a set of narrow assessments that everyone spent the last 2 decades trying to figure out how to game. And so, personally, look, I care about reading, I care about math. Let's be clear about that. Everyone should read, and everyone should be able to do math. I don't care about those standardized tests, and nor do kids and families, and if they're not getting them jobs and lives and careers. that they want. And so there's a real misalignment. That in my mind, when I had my very first charter that was 30 pages long, and now they're like 800 pages long, it was literally all about like, what do families want and need? And what they want is they want their kids to have a good life. They want their kids to have a fulfilled life. And that is not about doing well on standardized tests. It's literally about having meaningful, engaging experiences that lead to lives that are filled with purpose and work that make them money, so they can live the life they want to live. And so this is one of my concerns about the charter movement, is in that effort to only regulate on certain things, we narrowed it so much that that's what everyone is goaling towards, and we're missing the whole mark.
I think we're at a moment that's really difficult because what we want is different than what we have been regulating for, as Diane said. And you are, as a parent, kind of facing a choice of quality arbiter in the state on the old standards, which are not really standards, they're like content requirements, or nothing. And that's just too much space. Like, we have to have a public dialogue around what are the things that actually lead to the fulfilled life we want our young people to have? What amount of flexibility do you need to be able to deliver that? Because it's way more than charters are getting. Is it anything you want? I don't know, but like, that's a dialogue I really hope we get into, because the super hyper-regulated standards that are like a giant binder of everything your kid is supposed to learn, that all of us who have kids know is bad for kids, and it's driving teachers out of the profession too, we should say, right? Not good. Anything you want in the wild, wild west, not my favorite answer, personally. So I want some middle space for us to have that discussion of what's a true standard? Like, what is it you do need to actually accomplish, and then give you some freedom and flexibility for how to do it, with some safety standards and, like standards, as opposed to like giant binders full of content you have to master.
So maybe there's like a set of themes. There's safety, there's academics, there's social emotionals, and maybe there's, I don't know the answer. So I think I made this joke last time, but the more time I spend in the space, the more libertarian I become. Because I just like, no, like, we've tried doing a top down, it doesn't work, we don't know what's right, let the parents decide. Now, I'm a parent, and I don't think I could actually decide if my child's school is all that good. So I can see her, yes, she's starting to read, she's starting to do math, great, like, she is developing, but does that mean she's getting a good education? I don't know. So I don't think like total white space is the right answer, but maybe there's a set of themes, and then maybe a micro school can opt in to say, we choose to apply these themes. And if you as a parent think those themes are valuable, we'll give you regular reporting. And maybe there's like a national body that can accredit us or provide us some sort of a validation that we have complied with this. Maybe there's some sort of a bottoms-up evolution of standards. Maybe we try that for a few years before imposing another top-down thing.
Accreditors are
Yeah, no cartels, no cartels.
I think it's important to think about charters and vouchers / ESAs as kind of two paths that heavily influence each other. I mean, they roughly started kind of in terms of implementation in the 90s. Charters essentially became more popular, especially in the 2000s, 2010s. They grew faster. And then I think the last 5 years has been kind of a reversal of that. I think a lot of the policy in private school choice is actually heavily influenced by what happened in the charter space, and that can't be taken for granted. There's a lot of really great entrepreneurial leaders who started fantastic charters and charter school networks, and then after years of kind of fighting a lot of the same regulatory battles, decided, you know what, I want to start my own micro school, or I want to start a private school network. And so there is actually charters have been heavily influenced, I think, in terms of that. And so when we're talking about quality, yes, we can certainly talk about kind of what the government should regulate, especially if it's coming, with government money. But I think there's also a really important role that charters have played in that essentially charters over the last 35 years have led to a massive influx, I think, of really great human capital into the K through 12 education system that otherwise wouldn't exist. Places like KIPP, Achievement First, Rocket Ship, Great Hearts, right? Kind of attracting entrepreneurial leaders leaders into it. And then I think similarly, as some of those states have almost regulated growth out of existence, you have seen that then transfer, also with philanthropic dollars. And so I think when we're kind of talking about what role they can play, I think it would be great to adapt kind of some more almost self-regulation of, hey, we want to make sure that our schools are high performing, so we're going to do this, rather than wait for perhaps the inevitable government to step in and then say, you know what, something happened here, right? This school shut down. We now have to step in and we're going to make this kind of blanket rule that's going to cut off a lot of entrepreneurial activity. I think charters were great, but one of the mistakes that we made, and I can say this, I didn't start 8 charters, I was a teacher at a charter, but one of the things that I think they ended up doing was they kind of went into a dead end, which is a lot of the charters ended up as no excuses schools, where it was basically just like one kind of flavor, and a lot of the philanthropic activity all followed that. Walton and everyone else was kind of funding that. A lot of the, I'd say, major cities, New York, Chicago, Boston, that's what they wanted. And so I think one of the very exciting things about the private school choice space is that hasn't necessarily happened yet. And I think you are seeing kind of a wider variety. Whether or not that will play out, I think is up for grabs.
So I'm curious, as we think about that wider variety, if we think family accountability can be that principal agent on it, or is it really the operators getting together and self-regulate? Because I feel like I've said this a lot in higher ed boot camp spaces and no one listens to me. So I'm just sort of curious what that looks like. And I'll give you the case study that's happened in the last few months. For those that didn't read in the 74, is Linda Jacobson here, the reporter? There you are. So you can tell the story better than I can, but wrote a story about in West Virginia, High of Learning Academy, which was a micro school that had started up there, made some promises to parents. I believe the quote in your article was glorified babysitting is what it actually looked like. And parents got pretty upset after a couple months of this and demanded their money back and got their money back and made different choices. Is that a good example of accountability in action, or should we be thinking about something more proactive on the front end?
Yes, it's a good example. 100% it's a good example. I mean, the problem has always been that most people literally only have one choice of a school, and the government makes you send your child to it, period. And so you don't have a choice. People's choice is not between school, so I think it is. And I would argue that, and I don't know exactly how to do this yet, but I'm working on it, is how do we have, employment outcomes as accountability for what schools are doing, and that would help us in both K12 and higher ed, because all those systems should be a means to an end, not the end. And so, do people come out of these systems able to actually do things that people will pay them to do? We don't like talking about these things in education. We don't like talking about people having to actually make money. We want to talk about all these other things, but that's what families care about.
So 100% agree, that is a very good outcome that, in the way of that's how accountability should work. The other thing that we should talk about is those parents saw very quickly what was happening in their micro school. They had direct line of sight into the physical space, who the educators were, what kind of programming was happening. There was no metal detector, you can't go in, we can speak to you in 6 months at the parent-teacher conference. That's another sort of element of the value of small schools and small flexible environments where the parent is a customer, not a captor or captive, right? They're not a prisoner, they're a customer. And so these parents said, I'm gonna exercise my rights as a customer and choose to leave. I want my money back. And at KaiPod, sometimes that happens too at our micro schools. Sometimes the parent says, I'm not happy with this one thing that happened. And we say, all right, we understand. You have choice. And I sort of say Phoenix, which is one of the hottest competitive markets in the world for choice, it's like being a chef in New York City. If you can make it in New York City as a chef, you can make it anywhere. Same thing in Phoenix. If you can make it as a micro school operator in Phoenix, those customers are high expectations. They really want everything to be just right for their student. And so that makes us stronger as a network. And so that's a phenomenal amount of accountability that no government agency could ever replicate.
I saw you wanting to get in there, Kim. Go for it.
Yeah,
Don't hold
I'm
back.
struggling with this a little bit. Yes, I'm glad parents have a choice to leave. I've felt a captive. I've been a homeschooler. I've been in charters in terms of my kids. So like, I've been in all these environments, and I deeply believe parents and kids should not be forced to stay in a school because of the geography of where they live. So like, 100% agree on that. And it is different if you are in Phoenix, and there are actually other options for you. Because if you're in a crappy micro school somewhere and there are no other choices, to then say the way we're going to handle accountability in that market is parents will vote with their feet is disingenuous, because they can't really vote and go anywhere else there either, even though it's not like compulsory. They still don't have a choice. So I would want us to pay attention to, do you actually have another option that's affordable? And when my kids were in the environments where we had that great line of sight, what we didn't have from the provider, and I don't have this in a district school either, but I just don't want us to let us off the hook in this competitive market, is what you really want to know as a parent is my kid on track for what it is that I think they're trying to develop here? So they're developing better life skills, okay? How do I know if they're on track? So the space between I've signed them up and I've had to walk, there's a lot of space there. And in a lot of these emergent microschool environments, they aren't able to talk about whether they're on track. They don't have metrics. They don't have different assessments. And I'm okay not using the old assessments, but use something. Like, have an infrastructure that isn't only moving money. Have an infrastructure that provides navigational help to parents or helps them to see, do they want to walk? Like, shouldn't they be able to engage before it's time to walk, where they're saying, hey, I'm not sure this is right, or my kid's doing great on one thing, but not mastering math. So like, I feel like we're going from one extreme to the other and sort of missing the messy middle, which is where most of the work has to be done, I think.
So let me jump in there, because Patricia Levesque of Excel in Ed came out with this, I thought, thoughtful post in terms of offering a circumstance-based way to think about these regulations. And she basically introduced the idea of a continuum. So on one end, she said, traditional district public schools, they have the ability to tax, eminent domain, et cetera, right? Heavier regulation. Makes sense. You really, it's given all that you have said, we're going to have the accountability and a lot more on that. And then on the other end of the continuum was the homeschool or private pay options, where it's your own dollars. And then she sort of had adjacent. So in between was charter schools closer to district schools, and then public pay private schools, these education savings accounts or voucher programs, and we might want to get into the difference in that in a moment as well. But and her suggestion there, if I have it right, was basic safety, health, and then a test of the private school's choice to indicate progress that they get to choose. How do you all feel about that? Where does that regulation land for you all?
Wait, what is she saying?
So that the private school gets to choose the tests that administering to students, so that we're getting that
Tells
feedback.
you on the front end. This is how we're going to assess whether we're on track for our own
And so
goals.
these are the tests. And I guess the question I have is, as a parent, how do you know to trust those? What does that mean to you? How does that inform you, and so forth? Because it feels
and
different.
the tests suck. So
Well, that's the question I'm at. Yeah.
I think you still need like a navigation layer. Like in healthcare, there's often a navigation layer to help you find the best doctor for you. I think there is a need for that as you get more choice. In Phoenix, if you have hundreds of micro schools to choose from, you need someone to help you navigate that. There are a lot of nonprofits showing up that can do that really well. They start to understand the pros and cons of different tests and different accountability metrics, how successful a micro school has been, what their retention rates are. And I think that layer can play a really important role for parents. That feels more market-driven than anything else we've seen so far in education.
Joe, are you seeing that develop? I mean, because you're looking at these.
I think two things. One, I think going back to kind of the history, if we're thinking about private school choice, I think we're much earlier than we are relative to charters. Universal private school choice, which is mainly what we're talking about here, really only started less than 2 years ago in Arizona, when it expanded from a limited eligibility criteria to essentially anyone as long as they are in K-12 and they're a resident of the state. And so in terms of what needs to be built to support that, most of it hasn't been built. And so I think one thing that we're talking about here is the idea of kind of family navigators. There's good examples of this in Arizona, in Florida, in Texas. In Arizona, there's an organization called Love Your School. Basically can call, text, email, say, hey, my son or daughter isn't thriving in this school. We need another option. What do you suggest? And then it's basically usually a parent, often volunteer, sometimes paid, who is actually then responding and saying, oh, well, have you checked out this charter school? Or have you heard about the ESA? Maybe you can sign up for that. There are similar programs in Texas, in Florida, and I know for states that have recently passed ESAs, those organizations are actually increasing and going into those new states. So I do think that's probably a missing layer for a lot of this. And it does replicate some of what happened with charters in new cities. As choice kind of expanded, there was a complexity that someone had to navigate. And so there were kind of things like one application, in New Orleans and other things like that.
It's occurring to me that this is another marker of it. We're in a different time, and that not just in education, but across the board, we know people have lost faith in institutions, and they're very skeptical of them. They are not trusting, and so this idea of trust and is huge. Like, who can I actually trust? I mean, I think for those of us who lead or run schools, one of the challenges we're up against is people are coming to our doors not trusting us in the way that they used to, and you just look at the decline in trust of schools over the years. And so, and what we're talking about here, what's interesting to me is like, oh, one thing happens at my school, and now I'm looking for another school. And I know I'm going to make your argument you usually make when we're having this conversation, which is, what about the commitment to community? If everyone's only in it for themselves, and the second that, I didn't get the thing I wanted, or I had a bad interaction, or someone said something to me the wrong way, and I'm out, do I have any investment in the school or the community? And having run little baby charters that grew big, in the beginning, we all longed for the first days, because I'm sure this is the beauty of micro schools, right? Everyone's in it together. You're all starting up. It's hard. It's like a family. You fight with each other, and it's hard, but you love each other, and you're in it together, and you're rolling up your sleeves together. And one of the hard parts about running a big successful charter network is people come with very different expectations then, and they're not building with you anymore. They want what's marketed and all of those things. And so it's a rough time to be on both sides of both running the school and try to create the environment and trying to find your way through as a family.
So I want to stay on this point. When you said this about trust, trust is the coin of the realm, which President Ford tried to say in the wake of President Nixon's impeachment. He didn't quite get it correct, but what I would love to hear you reflect on is that common good aspect of it, which is adjacent to the community piece, and Kim, you brought it up, and coherence also, right? Like, are there things that we say, yeah, everyone ought to have reading literacy, everyone ought to have math literacy, as Diane defined it on Class Disrupted. Are there certain things about the nation and civics and any shared history that we want everyone to have, or do we believe content is, you get to choose your content and it's more about the skills you develop out of it? Because that seems like something that we need to wrestle with as well, because there's lots of flavors, as you all know, of these micro schools emerging in a much wider swath at the moment than we've seen in the charters in recent years. I'll let anyone jump into that fray first.
I'll jump in. Okay, fine. So
you wanted to have the conversation, so here we go.
Totally. So I do believe that we all want to have a society and a democracy that actually functions reasonably well. I think one of our great strengths is our diversity, a country largely made up of immigrants. I honestly believe, and the research shows this, that when you mix people up who come with a different perspective, you get more innovation. I believe it's why we have such an innovative economy. Like, these are strengths for us. They're strengths that we're at risk of losing as we encourage people to balkanize, as we shut down visas for students. There's all kinds of things we're doing that I think are reducing the strength of our country and our economy. So I would like to see us reverse trend on that. As it relates to this conversation, I think parents want their young people to have the skill of dialogue across difference, of being able to engage in a productive community with other people to solve problems together. Like, that's not controversial. It gets controversial, as you know, when you get into sort of the content of the history curriculum. But shy of that content, there's wide agreement in what parents want their kids to be able to do, which is like function in our diverse, interesting society. So I would love to see us have a dialogue around what's a new set. We need a different word for standards because everyone has PTSD for that. So I don't know what that word is, but pretend we have it. If we have a dialogue, state by state, community by community, and at the nation, because I think we have to do it top down and bottom up, we're going to see a lot of agreement on the skills, a lot of agreement on the content, and a couple areas of tense disagreement around the content. So I don't know what to do with those disagreement areas. That's tough. But let's not do nothing on all of that because we know we have some disagreement on some of the content areas. Let's get done everything we can do, which is a lot, and then figure out together how we solve that last bit, right? But it's just silly that we're doing nothing to establish this new set of agreements for like, hey, you're gonna do it totally differently in your micro school than some other guy's private school. That's okay, but can we sign on to this set of competencies and skills and basic knowledge with truly having a wide space to do other things differently, which is not what we did when we established huge content standards. But I think the agreement's out there, honestly. We're just not trying to get it done.
I think.
She disagrees totally.
Well, I mean, I try really hard. Clearly, I failed. I don't disagree with you. I think, one of the things that was so profound for me at Summit when we were doing Summit Learning across the country is everywhere we would go, I would have these community dinners, and every person wanted the same thing for kids, and it was like, well, why can't we just do that then? I don't know.
See a diversity of schools. So as we sort of wrap up here, I'd love both of you guys to weigh in with your views on this question.
I don't disagree, but I'm trying to act as a foil to say like what the counter argument might be.
Sure.
I think there are people who say the whole attempt to agree on a common core is offensive to me. I think there are some people out there that think that. I'm not saying they're right. And so do we then once again push them away and once again speak to our own bubbles by saying, hey, let's at least agree on the 80%. We're just pushing those people away again. And so again, I don't know if I truly believe this, but part of me says we should just let a little bit of thousand flowers bloom happen for a few years. And if the balkanization increases, we have to figure out how to solve that. But maybe schools aren't the place to solve that. Maybe schools aren't supposed to solve society's largest problems. They're just supposed to teach kids to read and write. And we have other institutions in society to do the trust building, the institutionalization of civics and citizenship. And maybe we're trying to do a little bit too much in schools, and that's what's pushing them to the brink.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think actually that there are a number of schools both on the right end of the political spectrum and actually on the left end of the political spectrum who don't participate in private school choice programs because they want to maintain their independence. And part of that is their vision of what the common good is would differ from that state, the larger society. And so I do think that there is, when we talk about charters, when we talk about ESAs, we talk about them as if they are kind of a solid block. And it is very different. Once again, the private school law in New York, which is actually highly restrictive for private schools, there's very specific standards. It's heavily influenced by the public school curriculum. It's very different in Texas, where there is very, very, very little regulation. And so I do think that even within states, there can be more of a vision of the common good that's shared across private school, and public school choice. It really just kind of depends on the state. Blue states generally like to regulate and be more prescriptive with most things. Red states generally kind of tend to avoid those things. And so I think part of that is just what do people in those societies want? And then people kind of often maybe sort themselves. And I don't necessarily know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's typically what I see.
It's a thing. No truer words were spoken. It occurs to me that as we wrap up here, there are no easy answers to these questions, so I'll apologize for not giving resolution. But we also saw some pretty big areas of agreement across different of these questions as we struggled through it. And so I hope everyone can take something away from it, pull it into their daily work as we continue to try to give each individual what they need to be prepared for a successful life. So join me in thanking Diane, Kim, Amar, Joe. Thank you.